but null. And null is the null object. It has no properties, certainly not one called onSubmit, which is why Chrome is freaking out and not doing anything. And in fact, Chrome and most browsers approach when there's a JavaScript error is just to forge ahead blindly. In this case, it submitted the form, irrespective of my return false. Why is all of a sudden the demo element null? Yeah. Exactly. It's because the browser is parsing this code top to bottom, left to right. And at this point in the story, when I'm reading the script tag in its new location, I can call getElement by ID of quote unquote demo all I want. It won't exist until we get down there. But I'm calling this line of code here, which is why sort of coincidentally, my code worked fine before, even though I put my script tag still in the file, but below. But this too, in the spirit of keeping my code separate from my HTML, feels a little hackish to just solve all of my JavaScript problems by putting my code at the very bottom of my files. Hopefully there's a better way than that. And there is, if we scroll back to our demos here, and let me go into the last version of DOM, DOM 2, which hopefully works. Hello, Rob. In fact, works. Let's take a look at this code here and see what's different. All right, my HTML seems to have been vastly simplified, and I'm now practicing what I've been preaching about not commingling code with my raw markup. In fairness, I've just moved it up to the top, but at least now it's inside of the head element, which at least is sort of conceptually distinct from the body, which is where the actual aesthetics of my page should be. And frankly, at this point, we could rip out this code and put it where? In a separate file called like file.js, like I suggested earlier. So we're almost there, but we'll just leave it with this example. But now I see some scary looking syntax and also one new script tag. What are we apparently loading into memory here? Yeah, jQuery. So jQuery is a super, super popular library for JavaScript. So popular that many people confuse JavaScript with jQuery itself, and they say, I know jQuery, when really they know JavaScript and they also know jQuery, but they're not alternatives to one another. What jQuery does is it allows you to dramatically simplify the amount and the complexity of code that you need to write, because some very smart people, one in particular, has spent a number of years now building up a corpus of code that just makes everyone's life easier. And it's all open source. You can read through it. It's thousands of lines long. But for our purposes, let's just focus on some of the highlights and some of the features that we'll see commonly throughout any library you might use for this first project, or really desktop development in general. So turns out there's a $, which is a popular aspect of jQuery. What does the $, represent in jQuery? What special significance does the $, have in JavaScript? It's a selector. So it is, but let's focus not so much on its functionality, but just syntactically. What is it? Syntactic sugar? It kind of is, but it's not even, I'm not even sure I'd call it that. It is just a valid symbol for a variable. So whereas in some languages $ has special meaning, like in PHP, it demarks an actual variable's beginning, or in some languages you just can't use it. You can't have a $ in a variable's name. JavaScript doesn't care. You can absolutely have a $, as the name of your variable. Now, jQuery, the folks who wrote it, just realized, oh, this would be kind of sexy if we just started using $ to represent our class called jQuery. But what this really is if I go into my code, and this is, again, dom2.html. For those who've been using jQuery for some time and just taking it for granted, this is equivalent to that. There is we'll call it a class, even though it's not quite a class, called jQuery. And it takes an argument. And that argument can be a CSS selector. In this case, it's the actual name of a global variable document. But that's all it is. So it's not quite syntactic sugar in that it has no fundamental special significance. We humans just view it as something special. All right. So more properly, jQuery is a function. And there's a hell of a lot of functionality built into that one particular function. And among the things it does, and let's go back to the common case of having $, is it wraps traditional DOM nodes. So all of those rectangles we've been talking about, jQuery wraps them in the sense of making them a little wider and a little taller and adding more properties and more methods to them. On the end of the day, inside of it is still the original rectangle, but they've simplified the means by which you can talk to that rectangle from the tree. So $, open paren, close paren, document takes that document node from the top of the tree and just gives it more functionality, more power, if you will. .ready is a shorthand way of saying no matter how big this web page is, no matter how many lines of HTML there are, only call the following function when the entire page has been loaded top to bottom, left to right. So what this means is that this line of code can now be anywhere in our page, in the head, in the body, in another file. It doesn't matter whatsoever. That means wait until the entirety of the page is literally ready. So what am I passing to the ready method? So the ready method expects an argument whose data type is apparently a function pointer, so to speak. It expects a function as its argument. And now what am I doing? It's an anonymous function because I don't care what the thing is called. It just needs to exist and be callable. Open curly brace, and it's a little messy, but here is the other curly brace, close parenthesis. So it's starting to get a little hard to read, but notice open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open paren, open curly, close paren. So everything else is inside of this anonymous function. What is inside of this anonymous function? Turns out I'm doing the same kind of trick in the next line. $, quote unquote, sharp demo. So those of you familiar very well with CSS, this represents what? It's a CSS selector for the node whose ID is demo. So the hash sign means give me the node whose ID is demo. If you instead had .demo, that means give me the node that has a class of demo, and there's some other selectors as well. But this one means give me the one node whose ID is demo. .submit, they've simplified the wording, and jQuery does more than this, but rather than call it onSubmit, it's just called submit. And what does the submit function expect as its argument? It expects its own function, an anonymous function that it's going to kind of tuck away and call only when what happens? That element's submit handler is needed. So this is just a third and final way of associating an action, an event handler, a function, with an event, like form submission. So what happens next? Finally, it's boring again. Alert, hello, so-and-so. And in fact, I'm cheating here, or I'm mixing my syntax. What should this line 11 really be if I go into that code? Let me open up Notepad again, open up DOM2, and based on that lesson learned, what can I actually change this to? $, and hash name. So that's what I mean in part by jQuery simplifying otherwise fairly verbose code. Document.get element by ID can literally be summarized as $, because the jQuery function $, knows that when it's passed an argument that's not a global variable like document, which just gets immediately wrapped with a bigger rectangle, when it realizes, oh, this is a string, but this string starts with a hash sign, it knows that that means the rest of the word is the ID for a node in my DOM. So here again is just how jQuery simplifies our life, even though at first glance it absolutely looks more cryptic, but really it's ultimately saving us time. And again, we could factor out that code further into a JS file so that it doesn't even appear anywhere in our raw HTML. Whew.
Is that required for if you have unique ID? If two IDs have the same ID?
Good question. Is it required to have a unique ID? It is a error of syntax for you to give two elements in a web page the same ID. You might get back, I don't know offhand, you might get back an array of 2 or more nodes, but I think it's fair to say, and I think the spec probably says the behavior is undefined, certainly for a JavaScript library, but I don't know offhand. Other questions? Yeah. No longer. It's not quite that. It's just, this is literally the honor system. Like, for the web to work, all of us have to agree on some rules. And one of those rules is do not screw up and give 2 elements in a web page the same ID. And if you do, we're not sure what's going to happen. At least I'm not sure. There might be some formal definition. I'll look it up later tonight.
You have 2 elements with the same class.
That's fine. If you have 2 elements with the same class, you'll get back an array. And the following function will be applied to that array, effectively. Even though it's not quite an array, it's in a wrapper that jQuery returns. OK. All right, so not bad, but thus far all we're doing is manipulating DOM elements. It would be nice to start introducing some functionality. So why don't we go ahead and introduce a bit of storage capabilities. So where we left off, we had this thing here. And let's jump ahead to, I'm getting much better at this, local storage. So where can you store information in a browser when programming in JavaScript? Some of you might know from past experience, or now that you know JavaScript runs client-side, you have very few options to begin with. In window. So there's this global object called window that in theory you can store data in. But if that window closes, for instance, the browser quits, what happens to any variable